The day began like any other in downtown Chicago, but for Jonathan Kane, a billionaire real estate mogul, it was soaked in silence thicker than the fog rolling off Lake Michigan. He never laughed anymore. His penthouse, perched high above the bustle, was a mausoleum of frozen memories where time had stopped breathing. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're looking at an old photograph or remembering something you lost long ago. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will touch your soul. Jonathan Kane's empire stretched across Chicago's skyline like a monument to ambition. His name gleamed on 47 buildings, each one a testament to a man who had conquered the stock market before his 40th birthday. The morning sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, illuminating a space that felt more like a museum than a home. The silence was absolute. No ticking clocks, no humming electronics, no whisper of life. Even the air felt sterile, filtered through systems that removed every trace of the city's natural breath. His wealth was staggering. Real estate portfolios worth billions, investment accounts that grew by millions each quarter, cryptocurrency holdings that fluctuated like digital heartbeats he no longer felt. The numbers on his screens meant nothing now. Assets, liabilities, profit margins, Bitcoin values, all just cold digits dancing before eyes that had forgotten how to see wonder. His personal assistant had left precise reports on his mahogany desk: dividends from European properties, interest from municipal bonds, returns from venture capital investments. But Jonathan sat motionless, staring at a single photograph trapped behind bulletproof glass. The photo showed a woman with auburn hair and laughing eyes, Sarah, his wife of 8 years, taken on their last vacation to Michigan's Upper Peninsula. She was holding a wildflower crown, her dress caught in a summer breeze, her smile so radiant it seemed to illuminate the entire frame. That was 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days ago. Jonathan knew because he counted every sunrise since the accident that had stolen her from a rain-slicked highway on a Tuesday evening. The mansion around him reflected his inner desolation. Every clock in the house had been stopped at 8:47 p.m., the exact moment the hospital called. The windows remained sealed, their automated systems programmed to block the unpredictable Chicago weather. Temperature controlled, humidity regulated, air purified, everything designed to eliminate surprise, because surprise had brought only devastation. Even the housekeeping staff moved like ghosts, instructed to maintain silence, to dust around his grief without disturbing its careful arrangement. Jonathan's daily routine was a ritual of avoidance. He would wake at precisely 5:30 a.m., consume a breakfast of measured nutrients, review market reports that no longer excited him, and conduct business meetings where his voice carried the authority of billions, but no trace of passion. Lunch was eaten alone in his private dining room. Dinner was a solitary affair, accompanied only by the soft hum of the building's circulation system. He had built an empire, yet lived like a prisoner in a tower of his own design. The emptiness wasn't just emotional, it was physical, architectural, spiritual. His penthouse sprawled across 8,000 square feet, but he occupied maybe a tenth of that space. Entire wings remained untouched, furniture covered in white sheets like monuments to abandonment. The grand piano in the living room, Sarah's piano, stood silent, its keys gathering dust, its bench pushed precisely 18 inches away from the keyboard, exactly as she had left it after her last practice session. Outside his sealed windows, Chicago pulsed with life. The elevated trains carried workers and dreamers through the urban canyons. Street vendors filled the air with the aroma of grilled onions and Italian beef. Children played in Millennium Park while their parents shared coffee and conversation. But Jonathan experienced none of it. His wealth had purchased perfect isolation, complete control over his environment, and absolute protection from the messy, unpredictable, beautiful chaos of human connection. His investment portfolio continued to grow. Real estate developments bringing steady cash flow, technology stocks yielding impressive returns, government bonds providing stable income. His accountants managed trusts, offshore holdings, and charitable foundations that bore his name but not his heart. Money flowed like water through electronic channels, numbers increasing on spreadsheets that might as well have been written in a dead language. He was worth more than some small nation's GDP, yet felt poorer than the homeless man he glimpsed through his bulletproof windows, because that man at least still hoped for tomorrow. On this particular October morning, as autumn painted Chicago in shades of gold and crimson that Jonathan couldn't see behind his tinted glass, something was about to shift in his carefully controlled universe. He didn't know it yet, but 2 blocks below his ivory tower, in a cramped walk-up apartment that smelled of fresh bread and furniture polish, a little girl named Emily was about to ask a question that would crack open his frozen world like spring ice breaking on Lake Michigan. The wind was picking up outside, rattling the sealed windows with a sound like distant whispers. For just a moment, Jonathan paused in his morning routine and listened. But then he shook his head, returned to his financial reports, and tried to ignore the strange feeling that today might be different. After all, he had spent 3 years making sure nothing would ever be different again. Jonathan Kane's transformation from dreamer to fortress began long before Sarah's death, though he couldn't see it then. Born in Bridgeport, 3 miles south of his current penthouse but a universe away in spirit, he had been the son of a union electrician and a school secretary. The Kane family lived in a bungalow where the radiator clanked like a friendly ghost, and where Sunday dinners filled every room with laughter and the aroma of his mother's pot roast. His rise through Chicago's financial elite read like a modern American fable. Northwestern University, on a partial scholarship, sleeping 4 hours a night while working construction jobs to pay for textbooks. His first apartment was a studio in Wicker Park, where the elevated train shook the walls every 7 minutes, where he cooked ramen noodles on a hot plate and dreamed of skyscrapers that would someday bear his name. The breakthrough came at 26 when he recognized that Chicago's abandoned industrial districts could become luxury residential communities. His first development, converting a defunct brewery into loft condominiums, netted him his first $1 million. The second project doubled that profit. By 30, he owned a portfolio of properties across 3 states. By 35, his net worth had reached 9 figures, his investment returns were the envy of Wall Street, and his business model was being taught at Harvard. But wealth, Jonathan discovered, was a peculiar kind of prison. Each new acquisition brought fresh responsibilities, more employees depending on his decisions, larger sums of money moving through more complex financial instruments. His days became consumed by market analysis, property valuations, dividend calculations, and cryptocurrency fluctuations that could shift his net worth by millions in a single afternoon. Success demanded sacrifices, weekends, vacations, simple pleasures, and eventually almost everything that had once brought him joy. He met Sarah at a charity gala he had sponsored but almost didn't attend. She was a children's librarian from Lincoln Park, volunteering for a literacy program that his foundation supported. While other women at the event seemed impressed by his business achievements or the value of his real estate holdings, Sarah asked him about the last book he had read for pleasure. He couldn't remember, and her gentle laugh at his confession was like hearing music he had forgotten existed. Their courtship unfolded slowly, beautifully. She introduced him to small pleasures he had abandoned in his climb to the top. Sunday morning farmers' markets, midnight walks along Lake Michigan, picnics in Grant Park where they would people watch and share stories. Sarah didn't care about his portfolio diversification or his latest acquisition. She cared about his dreams, his fears. The boy from Bridgeport who still lived somewhere beneath the billionaire's carefully constructed exterior. Their wedding was intimate. 200 guests in a restored Chicago theater, with Sarah's students from the library reading poems during the ceremony. For their honeymoon, instead of the private island vacation his wealth could have easily afforded, they chose a cabin in Wisconsin where they could see stars unfiltered by city lights. Sarah taught him to identify constellations he hadn't noticed since childhood, and he remembered what it felt like to be amazed by something that couldn't be bought or sold. 8 years of marriage. 8 years when his wealth continued to multiply. Real estate investments yielding steady returns. Technology stocks providing explosive growth. Precious metals hedging against market volatility. But when money was just the background music to their larger symphony. Sarah kept her job at the library because she loved it, though his financial advisors noted it was unnecessary given their combined assets. They talked about children, planned for a future where his business empire would be balanced by a family empire built on entirely different values. The accident happened on an October evening much like this one. Sarah was driving home from a book fair in Naperville when a drunk driver ran a red light at 50 miles per hour. The impact killed her instantly, the police said, which was supposed to be a comfort but felt like another form of theft. No goodbye, no final words, no chance to say the 1,000 things that suddenly seemed urgently important. The funeral drew hundreds of people. Business associates, charity board members, politicians, and real estate moguls whose combined net worth could have funded a small country. But the people who mattered most were Sarah's library children, who sang songs she had taught them and left drawings in her casket. Jonathan stood in his black suit, accepting condolences that felt like white noise, watching as the woman who had given his wealth meaning was lowered into Illinois soil. In the days that followed, friends and advisors suggested he stay busy, focus on business, perhaps make some new investments to distract from the grief. His financial portfolio continued its upward trajectory as if nothing had happened. Market forces didn't pause for personal tragedy, but Jonathan found himself unable to care about profit margins or asset allocation. The numbers on his screens were just numbers, the wealth just weight. He began sealing himself away gradually, then all at once. First, he stopped attending social events. Then he eliminated unnecessary meetings. He reduced his staff, automated his systems, installed advanced security and climate control, and created a world where nothing unexpected could intrude. His penthouse became a climate-controlled shrine to Sarah's memory and his own paralysis. The clock stopped because moving time felt like betrayal. The windows stayed sealed because Chicago's weather was too wild, too alive, too much like the unpredictable beauty Sarah had taught him to love. His billions grew steadily through compound interest and automated investments, but he experienced none of the satisfaction or security that wealth was supposed to provide. He was the richest monk in the loneliest monastery, guarding treasures that had lost all meaning, and so he remained, morning after morning, in his tower above Chicago, counting money that couldn't buy back time, managing investments that couldn't invest in what mattered most, protecting assets that couldn't protect him from the one force he feared above all others, the possibility of caring again, and losing again, and surviving that loss again. It was into this carefully constructed tomb that Emily Martinez was about to wander, carrying nothing but a child's curiosity and a question that would make Jonathan's billions tremble like autumn leaves in a sudden wind. The Pilsen neighborhood spread below Jonathan's penthouse like a vibrant tapestry he had forgotten how to read. 2 blocks south and 30 floors down, where the elevated train rattled windows twice every hour, and where the scent of fresh tortillas drifted from corner bakeries, Emily Martinez was braiding her younger sister's hair before school. Her family's apartment occupied the 3rd floor of a brick walk-up that had housed 5 generations of Chicago immigrants. The rent consumed most of her mother Carmen's income from cleaning offices downtown, but the 2-bedroom space felt rich with life in ways that Jonathan's mansion never could. Sunlight streamed through windows that stayed open in all but the harshest weather. The wooden floors creaked with stories of children who had played here across decades. Every surface held evidence of love. Crayon drawings taped to walls, photos covering the refrigerator, house plants that Carmen tended like green prayers for growth. Emily at 11 possessed the kind of wisdom that adults spend lifetimes trying to rediscover. Her dark eyes held depths that seemed older than her years, yet sparkled with the unguarded joy of someone who still believed absolutely in goodness. Her school clothes were carefully mended, her shoes resoled twice, but she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who understood that worth had nothing to do with price tags. Every morning she helped Carmen prepare breakfast, scrambled eggs with cheese, toast made from day-old bread that the corner bakery sold for 50 cents a loaf, coffee stretched with milk to make it last longer. They would eat together while Spanish radio played softly, Carmen sharing neighborhood gossip while Emily talked about her favorite books from the school library. These breakfasts cost less than Jonathan spent on his daily vitamin supplements, yet they nourished souls in ways his expensive meals never could. After breakfast, Emily walked her sister Rosa to elementary school before continuing to her own middle school 6 blocks away. She knew every crack in the sidewalk, every corner where autumn leaves collected like golden coins, every shopkeeper who would wave from behind glass windows. This was her Chicago, not the gleaming towers of the Loop, but the living neighborhoods where families gathered on stoops during summer evenings and where everyone knew each other's sorrows and celebrations. At school, Emily was known for her gentleness with classmates who struggled, her patience with teachers who were overwhelmed, her ability to find beauty in ordinary moments. She collected stories like other children collected Pokemon cards, always ready to share tales that lifted spirits or provided comfort. Her teachers noted that she had a gift for asking questions that made people think deeply about what really mattered. On this particular October afternoon, as the autumn sun painted Chicago's buildings in shades of amber, Emily was walking home when she noticed something that made her pause. High above the street, in the gleaming glass facade of the Kane Tower, she saw a figure standing motionless at a window. The man appeared to be looking down at the city, but something about his posture, shoulders curved inward, head slightly bowed, suggested he wasn't really seeing anything at all. Emily stood on the sidewalk for several minutes, studying the distant figure. Her mother had taught her to recognize the language of sorrow, having survived her own share of heartbreak. Single mothers in neighborhoods like theirs developed an intuitive understanding of pain, in slumped shoulders, in eyes that looked without seeing, in smiles that stopped at the lips. From 30 floors below, Emily could somehow sense that the man in the expensive tower was drowning in a sea of silence. She asked Mrs. Rodriguez, who ran the corner grocery, about the building. "That's where the rich man lives?" Mrs. Rodriguez explained in Spanish, shaking her head. "Kane, I think his name is. Lost his wife a few years back. People say he never comes out anymore, just stays up there counting his money." She crossed herself and added, "Dinero without amor is like bread without salt. It feeds the body, but starves the soul." That evening, as Emily helped Carmen fold laundry in their small living room, she couldn't stop thinking about the figure in the tower. "Mommy," she said, carefully smoothing out Rosa's school uniform, "do you think rich people get lonely?" Carmen looked up from the basket of clothes they washed in the apartment's shared laundry room. "¿Por qué preguntas esto, mija?" Emily described the man she had seen, the way he stood so still against the glass. Carmen's expression softened. She had cleaned offices in buildings like that, had seen the empty conference rooms and sterile hallways where wealth accumulated, but warmth seemed rationed. "Money can buy many things, Emily, but it cannot buy peace for the heart. Sometimes the richest people are the poorest inside." That night, Emily lay in the bed she shared with Rosa, listening to the familiar sounds of their neighborhood, the rumble of the late bus, voices from the apartment above, the distant hum of the city that never truly slept. She thought about the man in the tower, imagining him in rooms too big and too quiet, surrounded by beautiful things that couldn't speak back or offer comfort. She remembered something her grandmother had told her before she passed away. "Emily, you have a gift for seeing hearts, not just faces. When you see someone's heart is broken, sometimes all they need is for someone to acknowledge their pain with kindness." Her grandmother had been a curandera of sorts, not with herbs or potions, but with an ability to offer exactly the words or presence that hurting souls needed most. The next afternoon, Emily found herself walking past the Kane Tower again. The doorman, impeccably dressed in a uniform that probably cost more than Carmen made in a month, stood behind glass doors that reflected the autumn sky like mirrors. Emily approached slowly, her natural shyness battling with something deeper, a sense that sometimes the universe placed people in each other's paths for unexpected reasons. She pressed her face against the glass and waved at the doorman, who looked surprised to see a child at his prestigious post. When he cracked the door open, Emily smiled her warmest smile and said, "Excuse me, sir, but could you tell me how to send a message to someone who lives here? I think there's a man up there who might need to know that people down here care about him." The doorman, accustomed to screening billionaire-eccentric requests from adults with hidden agendas, found himself charmed by Emily's direct honesty. There was something in her eyes, not cunning or manipulation, but genuine concern. He leaned down to her level and asked, "What kind of message, sweetheart?" Emily thought for a moment, then reached into her backpack and pulled out a drawing she had made during art class. It showed the Chicago skyline, but instead of gray buildings, she had colored them in warm shades of yellow and orange, with small windows glowing like friendly eyes. At the bottom, in careful cursive, she had written, "Even tall buildings need neighbors. From a friend below. I?" The doorman accepted the drawing with the solemnity it deserved. Something about this child reminded him of his own granddaughter, who lived in Phoenix, and who also saw the world through eyes that found hope in unexpected places. "I'll make sure he gets this," he promised. That evening, Jonathan Kane found the drawing slipped under his private office door. His first instinct was irritation. His security protocols should have prevented unauthorized materials from reaching him. But when he unfolded the paper and saw the child's colorful vision of his gray city, something cracked in the ice around his heart. For the first time in 3 years, 4 months, and 18 days, Jonathan Kane smiled. It was barely a smile, more like the ghost of one, but his face remembered the movement like a muscle memory returning from a long sleep. He held the drawing up to the light, studying the careful way the child had drawn windows that glowed with warmth, buildings that looked friendly instead of imposing. At the bottom of the page, almost as an afterthought, Emily had added a tiny figure standing on a sidewalk, looking up with hope instead of fear. That night, Jonathan's dreams were different. Instead of the recurring nightmare where he relived Sarah's accident, he dreamed of a city filled with golden light, where even the tallest towers had doors that opened to unexpected visitors, and where voices called up from the street not in anger or demand, but in simple recognition that everyone, no matter how high they lived, still needed to know they were seen. When Jonathan woke the next morning at his usual 5:30 a.m., the first thing he did was look for the child's drawing. It had been real. Someone 30 floors below had noticed him and cared enough to create something beautiful just to remind him that he wasn't as invisible as he had tried to become. For the first time in years, Jonathan Kane approached his sealed windows not to check market reports or security feeds, but to look down at the street where ordinary people were beginning their ordinary days, and to wonder if one of them was the artist who had painted his world in colors he had forgotten existed. Jonathan stood at window for 20 minutes that morning, longer than he had spent looking outside in 3 years. The child's drawing lay on his mahogany desk, its bright colors almost aggressive against the neutral tones of his carefully controlled environment. Below on the street, people moved with purpose, workers heading to offices, children walking to school, vendors setting up carts that would fill the sidewalks with the aroma of life. His morning routine, usually precise as a Swiss chronometer, felt suddenly disrupted. The financial reports from Tokyo and London sat unopened on his desk. His breakfast of measured nutrients grew cold as he found himself returning again and again to the window. Somewhere in the neighborhood below lived a child who saw tower windows, not as barriers, but as eyes that might need to know they were seen in return. The drawing troubled him in ways he couldn't articulate. It wasn't the sort of thing that belonged in his world. Too spontaneous, too hopeful, too alive. His penthouse was designed for predictability, and this splash of color upset the careful balance he had spent 3 years constructing. Yet he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. Instead, he found himself propping it against his computer monitor, where Sarah's framed photograph had reigned alone for so long. That afternoon, as autumn light slanted through his sealed windows, Jonathan made a decision that surprised even him. He instructed his security team to identify the child who had delivered the drawing, not for legal action or to issue warnings, but because something about her gesture had awakened a curiosity that his isolation hadn't entirely crushed. The investigation was simple. Building security cameras had captured Emily approaching the doorman, and facial recognition software quickly identified her as Emily Martinez, age 11, resident of the neighborhood. The brief report included details that his private investigators routinely gathered. Mother Carmen, employed by several downtown cleaning services, no father listed on school records, excellent academic performance despite economic challenges, no history of behavioral problems or involvement with authorities. But the clinical summary couldn't capture what Jonathan observed when his security team provided discreet surveillance footage of Emily's daily routine. Through telephoto lenses, he watched her walk her younger sister to school, the way she held Rose's hand at street crossings, how she stopped to help an elderly neighbor with grocery bags, the patience she showed explaining homework problems to a struggling classmate. There was something about the child that defied his understanding of how the world worked. In Jonathan's experience, kindness was a luxury that people afforded themselves only after their own needs were secure. Yet here was a girl whose family clearly struggled financially, who wore clothes that had been carefully mended, who carried lunches packed in recycled containers, and who nevertheless moved through her world dispensing gentleness as if it were renewable resource rather than precious commodity. On the third day after receiving the drawing, Jonathan made another uncharacteristic decision. Instead of eating lunch alone in his private dining room, he had his chef prepare a simple meal that he carried to his office window. As he ate, he watched the street below, and sure enough, at 3:47 p.m., Emily appeared, walking home from school with the same patient grace that had caught his attention in the surveillance footage. She paused at the exact spot where she had stood drawing his building, looked up at the tower with what appeared to be genuine concern, then continued toward her apartment. The entire interaction lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it left Jonathan with the strangest feeling, as if someone had knocked on the door of his 17-room penthouse and he had felt compelled to answer. That evening, Jonathan did something he hadn't done since Sarah's death. He left his penthouse, not for business meetings or necessary errands, but simply to walk outside. His security team, caught completely off guard, scrambled to provide protection for a movement they hadn't authorized or planned. But Jonathan insisted on going alone, just to the building's ground level, just to stand where Emily had stood and see what she had seen when she looked up at his tower. The October air was crisp with the promise of winter, carrying scents he had forgotten existed. Wood smoke from someone's fireplace, coffee from a nearby cafe, the earthy sweetness of fallen leaves. The city sounds that his penthouse acoustics had filtered into white noise revealed themselves as a symphony of human activity. Car horns weren't just noise, but communication. Footsteps weren't disturbances, but evidence of people with destinations and purposes. From ground level, his own building looked different, less like a monument to success, more like a fortress designed to keep the world at bay. He could see his penthouse windows, dark and reflective, giving no hint of the life that moved behind them. To anyone looking up from the street, those windows might seem empty, and perhaps in all the ways that mattered, they had been. Jonathan spent 10 minutes on the sidewalk, breathing air that wasn't filtered and temperature-controlled, listening to sounds that weren't engineered for optimal acoustic comfort. When he returned to his penthouse, the space felt even more silent than before, but differently silent. Not protective anymore, but isolating. That night, for reasons he couldn't explain to himself, Jonathan wrote a letter. Not an email or text message, but an actual handwritten note on paper that bore his personal letterhead. His handwriting, which had grown rusty from disuse, looked stilted compared to Emily's natural cursive on her drawing. "Dear young artist," he wrote, "thank you for reminding me that windows work both ways, for looking out as well as in. Your drawing brightened my day in ways you probably cannot imagine. I hope you continue to see the world in colors that the rest of us forget exist." He signed it simply, J.K., and sealed it in an envelope that he addressed to "The Girl Who Draws Buildings with Friendly Eyes, Pilsen Neighborhood." The next morning, he instructed his doorman to identify Emily when she passed and deliver the letter personally. The doorman, who had worked in luxury buildings for 20 years, had never received such unusual instructions from a resident. But something about the child had touched him too, and he accepted the task with the understanding that some gestures transcended his typical job duties. When Emily received the letter that afternoon, she read it twice before showing it to her mother. Carmen studied the expensive stationery and the carefully formed words with suspicion born from experience with wealthy people who sometimes took interest in poor children for reasons that weren't entirely pure. But Emily's joy at receiving a response to her drawing was so genuine, so uncomplicated, that Carmen's wariness began to soften. "He noticed me," Emily said, holding the letter like the treasure it was. "And he said I see colors that other people forget. Do you think that's true, Mommy?" Carmen looked at her daughter, at the child who found four-leaf clovers in vacant lots, who saw faces in cloud formations, who could make friends with stray cats and difficult neighbors, who drew pictures of buildings as if they were living creatures capable of loneliness, and knew that, yes, Emily saw colors that most adults had trained themselves to ignore. "See, mija," Carmen said softly. "You see with your heart as well as your eyes. Just be careful that others don't take advantage of such a gift." But Emily was already planning her next drawing, this one showing not just buildings with friendly windows, but tiny figures in those windows, looking out at the world with hope instead of fear. She didn't yet realize that 30 floors above her, Jonathan Kane was also planning, not another business acquisition or investment strategy, but wondering if it might be possible to open a window that had been sealed shut for 3 years, 4 months, and 21 days. Neither of them could have predicted that their simple exchange of drawing and letter was about to crack open something in Jonathan's carefully controlled world that would prove impossible to seal back up again. The correspondence between the billionaire and the child began with the cautious formality of diplomatic correspondence between nations that weren't entirely sure they spoke the same language. Emily's second drawing arrived 3 days after Jonathan's letter, this time delivered directly to his doorman with instructions that the nice man in the tall tower might like to see how she had imagined him. This drawing was more personal, more daring. Emily had sketched the Chicago skyline again, but now the Kane Tower had a figure visible in its highest window, not sad or lonely but curious, with one hand pressed against the glass as if he were trying to touch the world beyond. Around the building she had drawn birds in flight, carrying messages between the tower and the smaller buildings below. At the bottom she had written, "Everyone needs friends, even people who live in clouds." Jonathan studied this drawing for a full hour, amazed by the child's intuitive understanding of his isolation. The figure in the window did look like him, or like how he hoped he might look if he were brave enough to press his hand against the sealed glass, to signal that he was still present in his tower, still capable of connection. His response this time was longer, written on personal stationery rather than business letterhead. He told Emily about the view from his window, describing Chicago's geography in ways that might interest a child, how Lake Michigan stretched like an inland sea toward the horizon, how the autumn sunset painted the city in shades of gold and crimson, how at night the streetlights looked like fallen stars arranged in perfect grids. "I have been living in my tower for a long time," he wrote, "and I had forgotten that there were people below who might want to know about the view from up here. Thank you for reminding me that even tall buildings can have conversations with the ground." Emily's third drawing arrived with a letter of her own. Her handwriting was careful, each letter formed with the precision of someone who understood that words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. "Dear Mr. J.K.," she wrote, "My name is Emily Martinez, and I am 11 years old. I live 2 blocks from your building with my mama and my little sister Rosa. My mama works very hard cleaning offices downtown, and sometimes she comes home tired, but she always has energy to help us with our homework and to make sure we say our prayers before bed. I wanted you to know about us because I think maybe you forget sometimes that there are families below who think about the people in the tall buildings and hope they are not too lonely." She went on to describe her neighborhood, the corner bakery where Mr. Santos gave day-old bread to families who needed it, the little park where children played soccer with balls that had been patched multiple times, the community garden where Mrs. Herrera grew tomatoes that she shared with anyone who asked. It was a world as foreign to Jonathan as another planet, yet Emily's descriptions made it sound more appealing than any luxury resort his wealth could access. I drew you a picture of what I think your home might look like inside, she continued. I hope it has lots of windows and comfortable chairs and maybe some plants that grow toward the light. I hope you have pictures of people you love, and books that make you happy, and maybe a pet that keeps you company when the building gets too quiet. Igiu. The enclosed drawing showed the interior of what appeared to be a palace. Rooms filled with golden light, windows open to let in butterflies and songbirds, walls covered with paintings of families and friends, comfortable chairs arranged in circles as if people gathered there regularly for conversation. It was everything Jonathan's penthouse was not, yet looking at Emily's vision made him realize how sterile his actual living space had become. This time, Jonathan's response included something unprecedented: a photograph. Not a professional headshot or publicity image, but a simple picture he had taken with his phone of the view from his office window at sunset when Chicago's skyline was transformed into Emily's golden vision. On the back, he wrote, "This is what your city looks like from my window, when the light is just right. You were correct. There are colors up here that I had forgotten how to see." The letter that accompanied the photograph was longer than any personal correspondence Jonathan had written since Sarah's death. He found himself telling Emily about his childhood in Bridgeport, about his parents who had worked hard but always found time for Sunday dinners and bedtime stories, about dreams he had chased so successfully that he had left their dreamers behind. He wrote about Sarah, though he didn't name her directly, describing her as someone who taught me that the best things in life can't be bought or sold, only discovered and treasured. "I have been living alone for a long time," he admitted, "and I had convinced myself that solitude was the same thing as peace. But your drawings remind me that there is a difference between choosing to be alone and allowing loneliness to choose for you." Emily's response arrived faster this time, as if she sensed that their conversation had reached some crucial juncture. Her drawing showed two figures, one in a tall tower and one on a street below, both reaching toward each other across the distance that separated them. Above them, she had drawn a bridge made of light, connecting their worlds with something that looked like hope made visible. "Dear Mr. J.K.," she wrote, "I showed your photograph to my mama, and she said you have a very good eye for seeing beauty. She also said that sometimes when people are very sad, they forget that sadness is not permanent, just like winter is not permanent. Spring always comes, even when it seems like it never will." Emily went on to describe her family's traditions, how they lit candles during difficult times to remind themselves that even small lights could push back large darknesses, how they shared stories of their ancestors to remember that they were part of something larger than their current struggles, how they left extra food on their doorstep for anyone who might be hungry because her grandmother had taught them that generosity multiplies when it is shared. "I was wondering," Emily concluded, "if maybe sometime you might want to see our neighborhood from ground level instead of from way up high. I could show you Mr. Santos's bakery and the community garden and the place where Rosa and I feed the pigeons. I think you might like to see how different everything looks when you're standing in it, instead of looking down at it." Jonathan read this letter 17 times over 3 days. The child was inviting him into her world, not asking for money or favors, not seeking advancement for her family, but simply offering to share the simple treasures that comprised her daily life. It was an offer both innocent and profound, carrying the implicit message that friendship could bridge any gap, even the 30 floors and countless tax brackets that separated their realities. For the first time since Sarah's death, Jonathan considered the possibility that his isolation might not be protection, but prison. Emily's letters had become windows into a world where people cared for each other without calculating profit margins, where small acts of kindness were exchanged like currencies that enriched everyone involved, where community was built not through networking or strategic alliances, but through the simple recognition that everyone needed occasional reminders that they were seen, valued, and understood. That night, Jonathan made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. He wrote back to Emily, accepting her invitation to see Chicago from ground level, to walk in her neighborhood, and meet the people who populated her drawings and letters. It felt like agreeing to step outside his tower and into a world that might not have bulletproof glass or climate control, but that promised something his billions had never been able to purchase: the possibility of belonging to a community larger than his own carefully manufactured solitude. The meeting was arranged for a Saturday afternoon in October, when autumn had painted Chicago in the golden colors that Emily drew so naturally, when the air carried promises of winter but still held the warmth of remembered summer. Jonathan Kane, worth more than some small nation's annual budgets, prepared to step outside his tower and into the world of an 11-year-old girl who had seen through 30 floors of glass and steel straight into his loneliness, and who had offered to show him that there were still places where hope grew like wildflowers in vacant lots, persistent and beautiful and absolutely free. Saturday arrived with the kind of crisp October clarity that makes Chicago feel like the most beautiful city in the world. Jonathan Kane woke at his usual 5:30 a.m., but instead of reaching for financial reports from international markets, he found himself standing at his sealed windows, watching the neighborhood below come alive with weekend rhythms. Children emerged from apartment buildings in waves of bright jackets and excited voices. Vendors pushed carts toward corners where they would spend the day selling elotes and fresh fruit. Even from 30 floors up, he could sense the different energy of a community day when work schedules relaxed and families claimed the streets for themselves. He dressed carefully, conscious that his usual business attire would mark him as an outsider in Emily's world. The simple act of choosing clothes for a social rather than professional occasion felt strange after 3 years of isolation. He settled on khakis and a sweater that had been Sarah's favorite, clothes that made him look less like a billionaire and more like someone who might belong in a neighborhood where children played on sidewalks and neighbors knew each other's names. The security briefing took longer than expected, with his team expressing concerns about crowd control and unpredictable variables. Jonathan had never simply walked into an unsecured public space without advance teams scouting potential threats and escape routes. But something about Emily's world, the trust she showed in her letters, the uncomplicated nature of her invitation, made his usual precautions feel not just unnecessary, but insulting to her gift. "I'll be fine," he told his chief of security, a man who had protected heads of state and tech moguls. "I'm visiting an 11-year-old girl and her mother, not entering a war zone." At 2 p.m. precisely, Jonathan Kane stepped out of his climate-controlled building and into October air that tasted of wood smoke and freedom. The sensory shock was immediate. Sounds weren't filtered through acoustic dampening, scents weren't processed through purification systems, and the ground beneath his feet conducted vibrations from the living city instead of isolating him from them. He had forgotten that the world had texture, that it moved and breathed and pulsed with energy that no amount of wealth could artificially reproduce. Emily was waiting at the corner of 18th and Morgan, wearing a bright yellow jacket that made her visible 3 blocks away and carrying a small backpack that appeared to contain treasures chosen specifically for this adventure. When she saw him, her face lit up with a smile so pure and welcoming that Jonathan felt something crack open in his chest, not painful, but like ice beginning to melt after a long winter. "Mr. J.K.!" she called, running toward him with the uncomplicated joy of someone who still believed that good things happened when people made effort to connect with each other. "You came. I wasn't completely sure you would, because sometimes grown-ups change their minds about things when they get nervous." Jonathan knelt down to her eye level, a gesture that felt both natural and revolutionary. When was the last time he had looked at the world from a child's perspective, literally or figuratively? "I gave you my word," he said simply, "and I've been looking forward to seeing your neighborhood through your eyes." Emily's smile broadened. "Good, because I have so many things to show you. But first, I want you to meet my mama. She's a little nervous because she's never met a billionaire before, but I told her you write nice letters and that you seem lonely rather than mean." Carmen Martinez was waiting on the stoop of their building, wearing her best dress and an expression of protective wariness that Jonathan immediately recognized and respected. Here was a mother who had agreed to let her child spend an afternoon with a stranger because she trusted Emily's judgment. But who would defend her family with lioness ferocity if that trust proved misplaced? When Jonathan approached, Carmen studied his face with the intuitive assessment skills that single mothers in challenging neighborhoods developed as survival tools. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her initial concerns, because her posture relaxed slightly. "Mr. Kane," she said, in accented but careful English, extending her hand with the dignity of someone who understood that respect was earned through character rather than net worth. "Emily has talked about you constantly for weeks. She believes you are a good man who has forgotten how to be happy." Jonathan took her hand, struck by its calluses and strength, evidence of work that his billions had always purchased rather than performed. "Mrs. Martinez, thank you for trusting me with your daughter's friendship. She has brought light into my life in ways I'm still trying to understand." Carmen's smile was gradual but genuine. "She has this gift," she said, glancing at Emily, who was bouncing slightly with impatience to begin their tour. "She sees hearts instead of faces. Come, let me show you where we live before she drags you all over the neighborhood." Their apartment was everything Emily's letters had suggested, small but warm, filled with the evidence of lives lived fully despite financial constraints. The furniture was mismatched but comfortable, arranged to encourage conversation rather than display wealth. Photographs covered every available surface, showing extended family, school events, community celebrations, and ordinary moments elevated to treasure status because someone had bothered to preserve them. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread, and something simmering on the stove that made Jonathan realize he hadn't experienced true hunger, the kind that anticipates a home-cooked meal rather than simply requiring fuel, in years. Carmen offered him coffee served in a mug that had been hand-painted by a child's careful fingers, and the simple act of sitting at a family table, being welcomed into the intimate space where a mother and daughters shared their daily lives, moved him more than any business triumph ever had. "Now can we start our adventure?" Emily asked after the adult courtesies had been observed. "I want to show you everything before the light changes to evening colors." Their first stop was Santos Bakery, where the proprietor greeted Emily like a favorite granddaughter and where the scent of fresh pan dulce made Jonathan understand why people spoke of comfort food. Mr. Santos, learning that Emily's friend was the man from the tower, insisted on presenting Jonathan with a bag of pastries para compartir, for sharing, explaining in rapid Spanish that Emily had told the entire neighborhood about her correspondence with the lonely man in the sky and that everyone hoped he would find reasons to visit again. Emily translated with careful diplomacy, editing out what Jonathan suspected were more intrusive questions about his wealth and personal life, focusing instead on the warmth of the welcome and the community's pleasure at meeting someone Emily had described as a friend. The child, he realized, had been protecting his privacy even as she shared her excitement about their correspondence. They visited the community garden, where Mrs. Herrera was harvesting late tomatoes and where Emily had her own small plot dedicated to flowers rather than vegetables. "I know flowers don't feed people," she explained, "but I think they feed souls, and sometimes that's important too." Jonathan, standing among plants tended by families who saved seeds from previous seasons because buying new ones was expensive, understood that he was seeing wealth of an entirely different kind, time invested in growth, care shared across generations, beauty chosen over pure utility. The small park where Rosa and Emily fed pigeons became a revelation of urban ecosystem. Jonathan watched Emily divide breadcrumbs with scientific precision, verify common household spices, Rosa's shy questions about what clouds looked like from his tower windows, Emily's obvious delight in his company. All of it felt like water on ground that had been drought-stricken for so long that he had forgotten what growth felt like. The changes in Jonathan weren't immediately visible to his business associates or staff. He still arrived at meetings on time, still made investment decisions with the analytical precision that had built his fortune, still maintained the professional competence that kept his empire profitable. But people who knew him well began to notice subtle differences. His assistant remarked that he seemed to spend less time staring out his sealed windows and more time actually working. His housekeeper observed that he had begun opening curtains that had been closed for years, allowing natural light to compete with artificial illumination. Most significantly, Jonathan began to experience curiosity again, the world beyond his tower, which had seemed threatening and unpredictable during his years of isolation, started to feel interesting rather than dangerous. He found himself reading news stories not just for market implications, but for human interest. He began noticing architectural details in buildings he had previously evaluated only for their profit potential. He started paying attention to seasonal changes that he had once ignored because his climate control systems made them irrelevant. The Saturday visits became the highlight of Jonathan's week, the fixed point around which everything else revolved. He would plan his business schedule to ensure that nothing interfered with his time in Emily's neighborhood. He started carrying a small notebook where he would jot down questions to ask Emily or observations to share with Carmen. For the first time in years, he looked forward to something that had nothing to do with financial returns or business achievements. Emily, for her part, seemed to understand instinctively that her friendship was performing a kind of healing that neither medicine nor wealth could provide. She never mentioned his obvious loneliness or the sadness that still shadowed his eyes, but her presence was a constant reminder that joy was possible, that connection could be rebuilt, that hope was a renewable resource available to anyone willing to tend it carefully. Their friendship deepened through small shared experiences that created the kind of memories money couldn't purchase. They discovered that both loved the same flavor of ice cream from a vendor who set up near the park. They developed inside jokes about the personalities of regular pigeons. They established a tradition of watching sunsets from Emily's fire escape, where Chicago's skyline looked like something from a fairy tale, and where Jonathan could see his own tower from an entirely different perspective, not as a fortress, but as one building among many in a city full of stories and possibilities. Carmen began including Jonathan in the family's financial planning discussions, not because they expected him to solve their problems with his wealth, but because he had become someone they trusted with their hopes and concerns. She would ask his opinion about Rosa's college fund savings plan, or seek his advice about whether the family should move to a larger apartment when she could afford it. These conversations were revelatory for Jonathan, who discovered that people with very limited resources often made financial decisions with wisdom and long-term thinking that put his wealthy peers to shame. He learned about wealth management from a family that earned in a year what he spent on monthly maintenance for his penthouse. Carmen's approach to saving, setting aside small amounts consistently, prioritizing needs over wants, finding creative ways to stretch limited funds, reminded him of principles he had once known but had forgotten as his wealth removed most financial constraints from his life. Her investment philosophy was simple but sound. Put effort into things that appreciate over time, like education and relationships and community connections that provide security no amount of money can guarantee. But perhaps the most profound change in Jonathan was his growing awareness of how his wealth could serve purposes beyond his own comfort and security. Emily never asked him for money, but her letters and conversations revealed a world where small amounts of financial support could transform lives in ways that his large charitable donations to prestigious causes never achieved. The community garden needed basic supplies that cost less than Jonathan spent on a single business dinner. The after-school program where Emily tutored younger children operated on a budget smaller than Jonathan's monthly wine expenses. This awareness created both opportunity and tension. Jonathan wanted to help, but he didn't want to change the fundamental dynamic of his friendship with Emily, or impose his wealth on people who had shown him that happiness didn't require expensive solutions. He began to understand that charity, like friendship, was most meaningful when it grew from relationship rather than obligation, when it responded to actual needs rather than the giver's desire to feel generous. As autumn deepened into winter, Jonathan found himself facing a choice that would have been unimaginable months earlier. His Saturday visits had shown him that there were ways to live that his expensive lifestyle had obscured. Emily's family had taught him lessons about wealth and security and community that his business education had never included. But translating these insights into permanent changes would require more than weekend visits to another world. it would require fundamental alterations in how he structured his daily life, his business priorities, and his relationship with the wealth that had both blessed and cursed him. Standing at his sealed windows on a December evening, watching snow fall on a neighborhood where Emily was probably helping Carmen prepare dinner in their small apartment, Jonathan realized that his friendship with an 11-year-old girl had accomplished something that 3 years of isolation had failed to achieve. It had reopened the question of what his life was actually for, and whether the answer might be found not in the accumulation of more wealth, but in the sharing of what he already possessed with people who understood that the richest gifts were those that grew larger when divided rather than smaller. The first serious challenge to Jonathan and Emily's friendship emerged not from external forces, but from the very people who cared most about their welfare. It began with a concerned phone call from Jonathan's oldest business partner, Margaret Thornton, who had built her own fortune in Chicago real estate and who had watched Jonathan's withdrawal from social and professional obligations with growing alarm. "Jonathan," Margaret said during what was supposed to be a routine business call, "people are talking. You've been disappearing every Saturday for months. You've declined 3 major networking opportunities. And yesterday I heard from 2 separate sources that you've been seen in Pilsen having coffee with a family that cleans offices downtown. What exactly is going on?" Jonathan's initial response was defensive, but as he tried to explain his friendship with Emily and her family, he realized how odd it must sound to someone who measured relationships by their potential to advance business interests or social status. Margaret listened with the patience of someone who had known him for 15 years, but her concerns were impossible to dismiss. "I understand that you've been lonely since Sarah died," she said carefully, "but you need to consider how this looks to people who don't know your intentions. A billionaire spending time with an 11-year-old girl from a poor family. There are implications that could damage everything you've built, regardless of how innocent your motives might be." The conversation planted seeds of doubt that Jonathan found difficult to ignore. Margaret wasn't wrong about the optics, and her concerns reflected the harsh reality that wealthy men who form friendships outside their social circle were often viewed with suspicion. More troubling was his growing awareness that he couldn't adequately explain to someone like Margaret why his Saturday afternoons with Emily had become more important to him than board meetings or investment opportunities. The situation became more complicated when Carmen received a visit from a social worker responding to anonymous concerns about her daughter's relationship with an adult man whose background and intentions were unclear. The social worker, following protocols designed to protect children from exploitation, asked questions that transformed Emily's innocent friendship into something that required investigation and documentation. Carmen, who had grown up in a world where interactions with authorities were rarely positive, found herself explaining why she allowed her daughter to spend time with a billionaire she had met only months earlier. Her English, perfectly adequate for daily interactions, felt inadequate for conveying the nuanced reality of how Emily's natural empathy had created a genuine friendship that posed no threat to anyone. "He's a good man who was very lonely," Carmen told the social worker, but even as she said it, she realized how naive it might sound to someone trained to be suspicious of adults who sought out children's company. "Emily has a gift for seeing people's hearts, and she saw that he needed friendship, not anything else." Emily, unaware of the adult complications surrounding their friendship, continued to look forward to Jonathan's visits and to write letters filled with neighborhood news and drawings that captured her world in bright, hopeful colors. Her innocence became both protection and vulnerability. She couldn't imagine that anyone would see harm in their friendship, but her inability to understand adult suspicions also meant she couldn't defend against accusations she didn't comprehend. The crisis deepened when Jonathan received a formal letter from a law firm representing concerned parties who were prepared to take legal action if he didn't cease contact with the Martinez family. The letter didn't specify who these parties were or what legal grounds they claimed, but the threat was clear. His friendship with Emily was being interpreted as potentially predatory by people with enough resources to make serious trouble. Jonathan's own legal team advised him to end the relationship immediately, arguing that the potential damage to his reputation and business interests far outweighed whatever personal satisfaction he derived from the friendship. His lawyers spoke in terms of risk management and liability exposure, reducing Emily's trust and Carmen's acceptance to potential legal problems that needed to be eliminated rather than protected. For the first time since beginning his friendship with Emily, Jonathan found himself considering whether Margaret and his lawyers might be right. Perhaps his need for connection had blinded him to how inappropriate the relationship appeared to others. Perhaps his wealth and social position made it impossible for him to form genuine friendships outside his own economic class, without creating situations that endangered the very people he cared about. The Saturday before Christmas, Jonathan made a decision that felt like betrayal, but seemed necessary for everyone's protection. Instead of visiting Emily's neighborhood as planned, he stayed in his penthouse and wrote a letter that took him 4 hours to compose, and that felt like tearing pages out of his own heart. "Dear Emily," he wrote, "I want you to know that our friendship has meant more to me than I can express, and that knowing you and your family has taught me lessons about kindness and community that I will treasure forever. However, some adults believe that our friendship might cause problems for you and your mother, and I care about your safety and happiness too much to risk making your life complicated." He went on to explain, in language he hoped an 11-year-old could understand, that sometimes friendships between people from very different worlds created misunderstandings that could hurt innocent people. He assured Emily that she had done nothing wrong, that their friendship had been pure and good, but that he needed to step away to protect her from adult problems that had nothing to do with the love they shared. The letter included a substantial check made out to Carmen, with a note explaining that it was not payment for Emily's friendship, which was priceless, but a practical gesture to help with expenses that a single mother shouldn't have to face alone. He hoped Carmen would understand that the money came from gratitude rather than guilt, from a desire to help rather than an attempt to buy absolution. Jonathan sealed the letter with hands that shook slightly, then instructed his doorman to deliver it personally to Emily's apartment. He spent the rest of the day standing at his sealed windows, watching the neighborhood where Emily lived, and wondering if he was making the right choice or simply taking the coward's way out of a situation that required more courage than he possessed. That evening his penthouse felt more silent than it had in months. The Christmas tree that Emily had convinced him to buy stood in the corner, decorated with ornaments she had made in art class and with lights that seemed to mock the darkness that was closing around his heart again. The photograph of Emily's family, which had joined Sarah's picture on his desk, looked like evidence of something beautiful that he had been too weak to protect. Jonathan Kane, who had built a fortune by making difficult decisions under pressure, had never faced a choice that felt more consequential or more impossible than this one. In trying to protect Emily from the complications his wealth and social position had created, he might have lost the relationship that had finally taught him what his money was actually worth and what it could never buy. Outside his windows, it began to snow, covering Chicago in white silence, while somewhere in Pilsen, an 11-year-old girl was probably reading a letter that would break her heart and wondering what she had done wrong to lose the friendship that had meant so much to both of them. The letter reached Emily on a Saturday morning when she had been expecting Jonathan's usual visit. Carmen found her daughter sitting on her bed, holding the expensive stationery with tears streaming down her face, trying to understand why adults could complicate something as simple as caring about another person. "Mija," Carmen said softly, sitting beside Emily and reading the letter that had destroyed her daughter's trust in a world she had always believed was fundamentally good. Sometimes being grown up means making choices that hurt, even when you don't want to hurt anyone. Emily looked up at her mother with eyes that held a new kind of sadness. Not the clean grief of loss, but the complicated pain of betrayal mixed with love. "But he was my friend, Mama. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He was just lonely, and I was trying to help him not be lonely anymore." Carmen held her daughter while Emily cried for the friendship that had taught her that sometimes the most generous hearts were also the most frightened, and that sometimes love required letting go, even when holding on would bring more joy. In her 11-year-old wisdom, Emily was learning lessons about sacrifice and protection that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Lessons that a billionaire had inadvertently taught her by choosing her safety over his own happiness. The check that accompanied Jonathan's letter remained uncashed on Carmen's dresser, a piece of paper worth more than the family's annual income, but carrying an emotional weight that made it impossible to spend. It represented everything that was wrong with a world where money could solve practical problems, but couldn't heal the hearts that created those problems in the first place. Christmas came and went in both households with a subdued quality that reflected the absence of something that had briefly made both families feel more complete. Jonathan's penthouse, decorated with Emily's handmade ornaments, felt like a museum displaying artifacts of a relationship that had been too beautiful to sustain. Emily's apartment, where Carmen had prepared her first Christmas dinner with a billionaire in mind, carried the ghost of an empty chair that represented friendship lost to fear. Neither of them knew that their separation was about to be interrupted by news that would force them to confront whether their friendship was strong enough to survive not just social disapproval, but circumstances that would test every lesson they had learned about love, sacrifice, and the courage required to protect what matters most. Winter in Chicago arrived with the kind of brutal honesty that strips away everything non-essential. By February, the separation between Jonathan and Emily had settled into a routine of mutual loneliness that both of them were learning to accept as necessary, if not natural. Jonathan threw himself into work with the mechanical intensity of someone using busyness to avoid thought. Emily resumed her daily routines without the anticipation that had once made Saturday mornings special, though she continued writing letters she couldn't send and drawing pictures of tall buildings that seemed further away than ever. The first sign that their carefully maintained distance might not be sustainable came through Carmen, who had been working extra shifts to avoid thinking about the check that still lay uncashed in her dresser drawer. During one of her late-night office cleaning jobs downtown, she overheard a conversation between security guards that mentioned Jonathan Kane by name. "Yeah, the guy from the tower," one guard was saying. "Paramedics were up there twice this month. Heart problems, they say, though he looks fine when I see him in the lobby. Rich people and their stress, you know. All that money don't mean nothing when your ticker starts acting up." Carmen finished her shift with growing unease. She had no claim on Jonathan's private medical information, and their friendship had been officially ended months ago, but Emily's influence had taught her to pay attention to her intuitive responses to people in distress. Something about the guard's casual mention of repeated medical calls felt significant in ways she couldn't articulate, but couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, Jonathan was indeed struggling with health issues that his team of expensive physicians couldn't adequately address. The chest pains that had begun shortly after he stopped visiting Emily's neighborhood were diagnosed as stress-related, possibly cardiac, requiring medication and lifestyle modifications that felt like further isolation from the life he had briefly remembered how to enjoy. His doctor, a cardiologist whose fees reflected his expertise with wealthy patients who wanted comprehensive solutions to complex problems, suggested that Jonathan's symptoms might be connected to grief that had never been properly processed. "Sometimes the heart remembers losses that the mind tries to forget," Dr. Rashid explained during an appointment that cost more than Carmen earned in a week. "The isolation you've maintained since your wife's death, combined with the recent ending of what you described as a meaningful friendship, has created stress that your cardiovascular system is finding difficult to handle." Jonathan's response was predictably defensive. He had survived Sarah's death, had built additional wealth even during the darkest period of his grief, had maintained his business empire despite personal challenges that would have destroyed weaker men. The suggestion that missing an 11-year-old girl's friendship could manifest as physical symptoms seemed to minimize his emotional resilience and professional competence, but the night episodes told a different story. Jonathan would wake at 3 a.m. with chest pains that felt like his heart was trying to escape the cage of his ribs, struggling to breathe in air that seemed too thin, his expensive sheets soaked with sweat that no amount of climate control could prevent. During these attacks, which the doctors insisted were not technically heart attacks but stress manifestations that mimicked cardiac events, Jonathan would find himself thinking about Emily's laugh, about Carmen's patient cooking lessons, about the community garden where people grew hope in small plots of urban soil. The crisis came on a March evening when spring was beginning to whisper promises of renewal through Chicago's still-frozen streets. Jonathan collapsed in his penthouse office, not from a heart attack, but from what his doctors would later describe as severe panic disorder complicated by depression that had been suppressed rather than treated. His security team found him unconscious beside his desk, clutching a photograph of Emily's family that he had been looking at when his body finally rebelled against the isolation his mind had imposed. 2 days later, as Jonathan was being monitored in a private hospital suite that cost more per night than most people's monthly rent, Carmen received a phone call that changed everything. The caller identified himself as Jonathan's personal physician and explained, with the careful language of someone who understood privacy laws but was genuinely concerned about his patient's welfare, that Jonathan had been hospitalized with stress-related symptoms that seemed connected to unresolved grief and social isolation. "I'm calling because Mr. Kane's medical history indicates that his health began deteriorating around the time he ended a friendship that had been important to him," Dr. Rashid explained. "I understand there were complications that made continuing that relationship seem inadvisable, but from a medical perspective, I believe he needs to address whatever feelings he's been suppressing." Carmen listened with the growing understanding that Emily's instincts about Jonathan's loneliness had been more accurate than any of the adults who had decided their friendship was inappropriate. The man her daughter had befriended hadn't been a threat to Emily's well-being. He had been someone whose heart was literally breaking from lack of connection, whose wealth couldn't purchase the medicine he actually needed. That evening, Carmen sat Emily down for a conversation that neither of them had expected to have. She explained as gently as possible that Jonathan was in the hospital, that he had been suffering from loneliness that manifested as physical illness, and that perhaps their friendship had been helping him in ways that none of the concerned adults had understood. Emily's response was immediate and certain. "We have to help him, Mama. I don't care what those other people said. He's our friend, and friends don't abandon each other when they're sick." Carmen looked at her daughter, at this child who had somehow maintained faith in the fundamental goodness of a friendship that adults had complicated beyond recognition, and realized that Emily was right. The social worker's concerns, Margaret's warnings, the lawyer's threats, had all focused on potential problems while ignoring the actual relationship that had brought joy and healing to people who needed both. "You're right, Mia," Carmen said, pulling Emily close. "But we need to be smart about how we help. There are people who don't understand, and we can't make problems for him or for us." Emily nodded with the seriousness of someone who had learned that love sometimes required strategic thinking as well as good intentions. "What if we just visit him like normal people visit sick friends? We don't have to make it complicated. We just have to show up." That night, Carmen made 2 phone calls. The first was to the hospital, where she left a message for Jonathan's doctor expressing interest in visiting their friend during his recovery. The second was to her sister, who worked as a nurse and who could provide guidance about hospital policies and appropriate visiting procedures. Meanwhile, in his private hospital suite, Jonathan was staring at the ceiling and wondering if his wealth had finally purchased him the ultimate isolation, a medical emergency that nobody would interpret as a cry for help, because billionaires weren't supposed to need help, and certainly weren't supposed to need it from 11-year-old girls who had more wisdom about healing than entire medical teams. He didn't know that 2 blocks away, Emily was making a card that read, "Friends don't give up on friends," in her careful cursive, or that Carmen was planning a visit that would test whether their friendship was strong enough to survive not just social pressure, but the kind of crisis that reveals what relationships are actually made of. The following afternoon, as March sunlight streamed through hospital windows, Jonathan Kane was about to discover that some gifts are too important to refuse, even when accepting them requires more courage than walking away ever did. The hospital visit was arranged through official channels that satisfied everyone's legal concerns, while allowing Emily and Carmen to do what they had wanted to do all along: show up for a friend who needed them. Dr. Rashid, impressed by Emily's mature approach to the situation and by Carmen's obvious sincerity, agreed to facilitate a brief visit that might provide exactly the kind of emotional support that medical interventions had failed to deliver. Jonathan, Propped up in a hospital bed surrounded by monitoring equipment that tracked every beat of his damaged heart, looked smaller and more vulnerable than Emily had imagined. The machines that measured his vital signs couldn't quantify the loneliness that had made him sick, but Emily could see it in the way he held himself, in the careful distance he maintained, even from people trying to help him heal. "Mr. J.K.?" Emily said softly, approaching his bedside with the same gentle confidence she had shown during their first meeting. "I brought you something." The card she had made was simple but perfect. Construction paper decorated with drawings of the Chicago skyline, with his tower connected to her neighborhood by bridges made of rainbow colors. Inside she had written, "Being sick is scary, but being alone is scarier. You don't have to be alone anymore." Jonathan took the card with hands that trembled slightly, whether from medication or emotion, Emily couldn't tell. When he looked up at her, his eyes held the same gratitude she remembered from their Saturday afternoon adventures, but also something new, recognition that she had kept faith in their friendship, even when he had lost faith in his ability to sustain it. "Emily," he said, his voice rougher than usual, "I thought I was protecting you by staying away." Emily's response was delivered with the clarity of someone who had spent months thinking about adult complications that interfered with simple truths. "You can't protect people by making them worry about you. That just makes everyone sad instead of just one person sad." Carmen, standing beside Emily's chair, added her own perspective with the practical wisdom of someone who had learned to navigate complex situations without losing sight of essential priorities. "Mr. Kane, Emily has been concerned about you since Christmas. She understands that some adults didn't approve of your friendship, but she also understands that abandoning someone who cares about you isn't the solution to other people's problems." Over the following hour, as afternoon light shifted through hospital windows, the three of them began to reconstruct their friendship on terms that acknowledged the complications that wealth and social expectations had created, while refusing to let those complications destroy something that had brought genuine healing to everyone involved. They talked about the letters Emily had written but not sent, the check that Carmen had never cashed, the Saturday afternoons that Jonathan had missed more than any business meeting or social obligation. Dr. Rashid, checking on his patient during visiting hours, observed something that expensive medications and advanced cardiac monitoring equipment had failed to achieve. Jonathan's vital signs were stabilizing in real time, his heart rate normalizing, his blood pressure dropping to levels that suggested his body was remembering how to relax. It was the kind of improvement that medical schools taught was impossible to measure, but that experienced physicians learned to recognize as evidence of healing that transcended purely physical interventions. "This is good medicine, dear doctor," Rashid told Carmen quietly, as Emily entertained Jonathan with stories from her neighborhood. "Sometimes the heart needs different prescriptions than we can write on paper." When visiting hours ended, Emily hugged Jonathan with the same uncomplicated affection she had always shown, while Carmen squeezed his hand and promised they would return the next day. As they left, Jonathan felt something shift in his chest, not the painful constriction that had been sending him to emergency rooms, but the pleasant ache of a heart that was learning to open again after months of defensive closure. That night, for the first time since his hospitalization, Jonathan slept without medication, his dreams filled not with anxieties about business obligations or social disapproval, but with memories of Saturday afternoons when an 11-year-old girl had taught him that the most valuable assets couldn't be listed on any financial statement. The following morning, he made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. He called Margaret Thornton not to discuss business, but to explain that he had been wrong to let other people's concerns override his own judgment about relationships that brought meaning to his life. He called his lawyers, not to seek protection from social criticism, but to establish a framework that would allow him to maintain his friendship with Emily's family while addressing any legitimate concerns about appropriate boundaries and proper protocols. Most importantly, he called Emily and Carmen, using the hospital phone to have a conversation that felt like coming home after a long, unnecessary exile. "I want you to know, he told them, "that these past few months have taught me that protecting someone by refusing to care about them isn't protection at all. It's just another form of abandonment. If you're willing to give me another chance, I promise I won't let other people's fears prevent me from being the kind of friend you deserve." Emily's response came through the phone with the clarity of absolute conviction. "Friends don't give up on friends, remember? We've been waiting for you to remember that too." 2 weeks later, when Jonathan was discharged from the hospital with a clean bill of cardiac health and a prescription for lifestyle modifications that emphasized social connection and meaningful relationships, Emily and Carmen were waiting to take him home. Not to his penthouse, which would always be part of his world, but to their neighborhood, where he belonged not because of his wealth or social status, but because he had earned citizenship in a community that measured value in entirely different currency than the markets where he had built his fortune. The ride through Chicago streets felt like returning to a country he had visited briefly, fallen in love with, and then spent months trying to convince himself was too dangerous to revisit. As they passed familiar corners and shops where people had learned to expect his Saturday appearances, Jonathan realized that Emily and Carmen had given him something more precious than friendship. They had given him the courage to choose connection over safety, meaning over convenience, and love over the fear of losing love again. His heart, monitored by the most sophisticated equipment available to modern medicine, was beating with the steady rhythm of someone who had remembered that the point of survival wasn't just to avoid death, but to live fully enough that life meant something worth protecting. Spring arrived in Chicago with the kind of gradual insistence that makes every green leaf feel like a minor miracle. By April, Jonathan's recovery had transformed from a medical event into a spiritual renaissance that surprised everyone who thought they understood how wealthy people processed crisis and change. His Saturday visits to Emily's neighborhood resumed, but with a difference that reflected hard-won wisdom about the relationship between privilege and responsibility, between caring for individuals and caring for communities. The uncashed check that had sat on Carmen's dresser since Christmas became the foundation for a conversation about how Jonathan's wealth could serve the neighborhood without overwhelming its organic systems of mutual support. Instead of grand gestures that might disrupt the delicate economics of working-class life, he began contributing in ways that felt natural and sustainable, sponsoring the community garden's expansion, providing scholarship funds for local children who showed academic promise, and ensuring that programs like Emily's after-school tutoring sessions had supplies and stability without publicity or recognition. Emily, who had watched adults complicate simple kindness with legal concerns and social anxieties, became an informal consultant on philanthropy that respected both the giver's resources and the recipient's dignity. Her wisdom about her neighborhood's needs and strengths guided Jonathan toward investments that multiplied rather than replaced existing community assets. "You can't just throw money at problems," Emily explained during one of their walks through the area Jonathan had come to think of as his second home. "You have to understand what makes places like this strong, and then help those things grow bigger instead of trying to fix everything with expensive solutions." Under Emily's guidance, Jonathan discovered that effective charity required the same skills that had made him successful in business: market research, strategic thinking, and attention to long-term sustainability. But it also required qualities that business school had never taught: humility, patience, and the ability to listen to people whose expertise came from living particular realities rather than studying them in abstract. The Community Garden Project became a model for how wealth could serve neighborhoods without gentrifying them out of existence. Jonathan's financial support allowed the garden to expand into adjacent lots, but under community management that ensured decisions about crops and projects reflected residents' needs rather than outside assumptions about what poor neighborhoods required. Mrs. Herrera, who had become the garden's informal coordinator, taught Jonathan about soil improvement and companion planting while he provided resources for better tools and season extension equipment. Their collaboration produced something neither could have achieved alone: a green space that fed families nutritious food while creating employment opportunities and educational programs that strengthened community resilience. The scholarship program developed along similar principles. Instead of selecting recipients through external criteria that might not reflect neighborhood values, Jonathan worked with local schools and community leaders to identify children who showed promise but lacked resources. Emily helped design application processes that honored different kinds of intelligence and potential, ensuring that kids like her, who possessed wisdom and compassion alongside academic ability, would be recognized and supported. Carmen's perspective proved invaluable in structuring these programs to support, rather than supplant, family stability. As someone who had worked multiple jobs while raising two daughters, she understood that the most effective support often involved reducing parents' financial stress rather than removing children from their home environments. Scholarships that paid for books, school supplies, and transportation allowed families to stay together while accessing better educational opportunities. Throughout these projects, Jonathan found himself learning lessons about wealth that his business education had never addressed. Money, he discovered, was like water. It could nourish growth when applied carefully, but it could also flood and destroy if released without understanding the ecosystem it entered. Effective philanthropy required the same attention to detail and long-term planning that successful investing demanded, but with entirely different measures of success. Emily's family became his teachers in this new curriculum. From Carmen, he learned about budgeting with precision that made his corporate financial planning seem wasteful. From Rosa, who was beginning to show her own gifts for art and storytelling, he learned about creativity that flourished under constraints that might have seemed limiting to someone with unlimited resources. From Emily herself, he learned about leadership that sought to lift others up rather than accumulate power or recognition. The neighborhood's response to Jonathan's presence evolved from curiosity to acceptance to genuine affection, as people recognized that his wealth hadn't made him arrogant or demanding, but rather more appreciative of assets that couldn't be purchased. He became a regular at Santos Bakery, where his Spanish was improving enough to participate in the morning conversations about everything from politics to soccer to the complex logistics of family life with limited budgets and unlimited responsibilities. His health, monitored by Dr. Rashid with the satisfied attention of a physician whose most successful case study couldn't be published in medical journals, remained stable in ways that reflected emotional as well as physical well-being. The chest pains and panic episodes had disappeared completely, replaced by the kind of energy that comes from living a life that feels purposeful rather than merely profitable. The transformation wasn't without challenges. Some of Jonathan's business associates remained puzzled by his new priorities, viewing his neighborhood involvement as an expensive hobby that distracted from serious wealth accumulation. His social calendar, once filled with networking events and charity galas, now revolved around community meetings and school programs that provided satisfaction but no prestige among Chicago's elite circles. But Jonathan discovered that he cared less about maintaining his position in social hierarchies that had never provided genuine friendship or meaningful purpose. Emily's world had shown him that status based on wealth was less secure and less satisfying than belonging based on contribution to something larger than individual gain. By summer, when the community garden was producing vegetables that appeared on dozens of neighborhood dinner tables, when 3 local children had received scholarships that would transform their educational trajectories, and when Jonathan's presence at community events felt natural rather than noteworthy, he realized that he had accidentally discovered what wealth was actually for. It wasn't for accumulation or display or protection from life's uncertainties. It was for creating opportunities for connection, for solving problems that affected people you cared about, for building systems that generated more joy and security than they consumed. Money, he had learned from an 11-year-old girl and her family, was most powerful when it served love rather than replacing it. The annual community festival in late August provided a perfect celebration of everything Jonathan and Emily's friendship had accomplished. Instead of feeling like an outsider who was tolerated because of his financial contributions, Jonathan found himself assigned specific responsibilities: managing the beverage station, helping with children's games, and serving as unofficial photographer for families who wanted memories of the day. As evening approached and families gathered on blankets to watch children perform songs and dances that celebrated their cultural heritage, Jonathan sat beside Emily and Carmen under stars that were visible despite Chicago's light pollution, because joy has a way of clarifying vision even in difficult conditions. "Thank you," he told Emily, though the words felt inadequate for everything she had given him. Emily's response was delivered with the matter-of-fact wisdom that had first caught his attention outside his tower months earlier. "You don't have to thank people for being your friend," she said. "That's what friends do. We help each other remember who we're supposed to be." Jonathan understood that she was right, and also that her simple statement contained philosophy that business schools and wealth management seminars had never taught. That the highest return on investment comes not from accumulating assets, but from investing in relationships that appreciate in value forever, that generate dividends of meaning and purpose that compound across generations, and that create wealth that can be shared infinitely without ever being depleted. As fireworks began to paint Chicago's sky in colors that Emily would certainly capture in her next drawing, Jonathan realized that he had finally learned to answer the question that had started their friendship. How is your performance? His performance. At living, at loving, at using his wealth not as a fortress against the world, but as a bridge toward it, was finally matching his potential, thanks to a child who had seen through 30 floors of glass and steel, straight into his heart, and had loved what she found there enough to help it grow. On a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after Jonathan Kane first noticed a small figure looking up at his tower from the Chicago sidewalks below, he stood at his office windows, now opened regularly to let in the sounds and seasons of the living city, and watched Emily Martinez walk her sister to school with the same patient grace that had first caught his attention. But now, instead of being a stranger whose kindness he observed from isolation, she was family in all the ways that mattered, part of a community that had taught him the difference between being wealthy and being rich. The penthouse that had once felt like a sophisticated tomb now buzzed with the kind of life that money couldn't purchase, but could certainly support. Emily's latest drawings covered the refrigerator alongside Rosa's school papers and Carmen's shopping lists, written in the mixture of Spanish and English that had become familiar music to Jonathan's ears. The grand piano that had stood silent since Sarah's death now hosted weekly music lessons for neighborhood children, filling the space with sounds of learning and laughter that echoed off walls that had forgotten such noises were possible. His business empire continued to generate impressive returns, real estate investments appreciating steadily, technology stocks yielding substantial profits, cryptocurrency holdings fluctuating through digital markets that operated according to algorithms rather than human emotion. But the numbers on his financial statements no longer represented the primary measure of his success. Wealth, he had learned, was a tool rather than a destination. Most valuable when it enabled the kind of life that made getting up each morning feel like anticipation rather than obligation. The community programs that had begun as simple gestures of gratitude had evolved into sustainable systems that improved lives without creating dependency. The scholarship fund now supported 12 local children, chosen not just for academic achievement, but for the kind of character that promised they would use their education to strengthen their communities. The expanded community garden produced enough food to stock a small market that operated on principles of dignity and mutual aid rather than traditional charity models. Most importantly, Jonathan had discovered that healing wasn't something that happened once and then remained permanently fixed, like setting a broken bone. It was an ongoing process that required daily attention, consistent choices, and the kind of community support that reminded him who he wanted to be when loneliness or old habits threatened to pull him back toward isolation. Emily, now 12 and showing the first signs of the young woman she would become, remained his most trusted advisor on matters of the heart. Her perspective on adult complications had grown more sophisticated over their year of friendship, but her fundamental wisdom about what made life meaningful had proven remarkably stable. She still saw hearts instead of faces, still found magic in ordinary moments, still possessed the gift for asking questions that made people examine their deepest assumptions about what they really needed to be happy. "Are you performing well now?" she asked him one Saturday afternoon as they sat in the community garden watching Rosa help younger children identify different types of butterflies that visited the flowering plants. Jonathan considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. His performance at living fully, loving freely, using his resources wisely, had improved dramatically since Emily first posed her challenging inquiry. But more than that, he had finally understood what performance actually meant in the context of a human life. It wasn't about accumulating achievements or maintaining perfect control over circumstances, but about showing up consistently for the people and purposes that made existence feel worthwhile. "I think I'm getting better at it," he answered, "though I suspect it's the kind of thing you have to keep practicing your whole life." Emily nodded with the satisfaction of a teacher whose student had grasped a lesson that couldn't be learned from books or lectures. "Good," she said, "because there are other people in tall buildings who probably need to remember that windows work both ways too." That evening, as Jonathan helped Carmen prepare dinner in the kitchen that had become a second home, he reflected on the year that had transformed him from a successful businessman with an empty life into a wealthy man whose resources served purposes larger than his own comfort. The change hadn't been dramatic or swift, no sudden conversions or life-altering revelations, just the gradual accumulation of ordinary moments that had taught him extraordinary lessons about what wealth could accomplish when it was guided by wisdom rather than fear. Dr. Rashid, during Jonathan's most recent checkup, had pronounced him not just physically healthy but emotionally robust in ways that suggested a man who had found sustainable sources of purpose and connection. "Whatever you've been doing," the doctor said, reviewing test results that showed cardiovascular function better than patients half Jonathan's age, "keep doing it. This is what healing looks like when the whole person gets well, not just the body." The prescription for continued health was simple. Maintain the relationships and commitments that had restored meaning to his days, continue finding ways to use his wealth for community benefit rather than personal comfort alone, and never forget the lessons that a child had taught him about seeing with the heart as well as the eyes. As Chicago's autumn painted the cityscape in familiar shades of gold and crimson, Jonathan Kane stood once again at his office windows, but now with hands pressed against glass that opened easily, breathing air that carried the scents and sounds of a world he belonged to rather than merely observed. Below on the sidewalks, families moved through their Saturday routines with the easy rhythm of people who knew they were part of something larger than their individual struggles. Somewhere in that neighborhood, other lonely people lived behind their own versions of sealed windows, convinced that protection and isolation were the same thing, that wealth or success or accumulated achievements could substitute for the kind of community that Emily's family had shown him. Perhaps some of them needed their own 11-year-old teacher, or perhaps they simply needed to remember that sometimes the richest gifts came from the most unexpected sources, at the moments when you most needed to believe that hope was still possible. And have you ever met someone small who changed your life in an immense way? Someone who saw through your defenses to the part of you that still dreamed of connection, still believed in kindness, still hoped that your resources, whatever they might be, could serve purposes larger than your own security. Tell me your story in the comments. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe so this message reaches another soul who also needs to believe again that wealth, whether measured in money or love or community, grows larger when it's shared, and that sometimes the best performance of our lives begins when we stop protecting ourselves from caring and start opening our windows to let life in.